Sometimes people have felt a pressure by the church to forgive or release a perpetrator of harm, as if forgiveness would be to say, what you did doesn't hurt me, what occurred doesn't matter. But actually, Christian forgiveness doesn't say any of those things. I think sometimes even in the church, we're kind of falling between these two stools of, I'm under this pressure to forgive because, Jesus says you've got to forgive. Even the Lord's Prayer says I've got to forgive those who sin against me. Yet this deep intuition that what happened to me really matters. It shouldn't be the case that forgiveness is cheap, but it feels cheap. Like abuse and evil really, really matter. How do we square that with the requirement to forgive? I think we need to examine what forgiveness means. Christian forgiveness doesn't say the abuse doesn't hurt, the abuse didn't matter, or it wasn't wrong. In fact, Christian forgiveness would be to say that the abuse does hurt, it does matter, and it was wrong, and it matters so much that to forgive it would require something huge. It would require actually the death of the Son of God in history. That's what the crucifixion of Jesus is about. It's saying the scale of evil is so great because human beings have been created in the image of God. Our value to God is so precious that to mar or harm that image in another person is utterly devastating. So to forgive it would require a sacrifice so great, a scale so massive that it would look like the death of Jesus in history. And so when as a Christian, I'm exercising that power of forgiveness, what I'm doing is I'm saying, I can't actually forgive you or release you because the hurt and the abuse and the scale of evil done is so hard and massive. But what I can do is I can hand it over to God. I can release you to the justice of God. And that will either mean that your transgression is forgiven because of the cross of Jesus, or it will mean you face the judgment of Christ after death. Now, if you actually end up accepting the forgiveness of Jesus through the crucifixion, through the cross, there are very few requirements, but one of the requirements is what the New Testament calls repentance. That is not cheap. One of the requirements of receiving forgiveness is acknowledgement of the harm. It means owning up and then seeking to turn around. So the one thing that Christian forgiveness doesn't do is let the abuser continue abusing. That might mean an abuser, if they own the harm they've caused, it might mean they pay a civil penalty for their crime because they would be owning up and saying, I did it. So I want to receive that heavenly forgiveness from Jesus. But that doesn't let me off the civil penalty of my crime. So I might need to go to prison. I might need to pay a civil penalty for what I've done wrong. Because in accepting the forgiveness of God, I'm going to own up to my need for that forgiveness. So Christian forgiveness is not cheap. It's not cheap for God. It costs the death of the Son of God in history. And it's not accessed as cheap for the person who's receiving it. What that means is for all of us, we can receive the forgiveness of God. All we have to do is come to Him in humility, recognizing our need for forgiveness. And what it means is if I've been harmed, I can release my need to get vengeance on my abuser. I can release that to God because either it's paid for in the death of the Son of God in history, or there's a coming judgment for the person who hasn't received that forgiveness where God actually will set things right. That means I can be released from being the vengeance bringer. And I can actually live at peace. So to offer someone forgiveness is to hand my vengeance over to God. That's so freeing. It certainly doesn't minimise the harm done.